One Saturday morning in March, my son-in-law knocked on my front door with a manila folder tucked under his arm and told me his parents would be moving into my house by the end of the month. I'm Ernest Baylor. I'm 64 years old. I taught shop and vocational education at Glen Ridge High School in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, for 32 years before I retired. I drive a 2005 Ford F-150 with 187,000 miles on it. I shop at the Kroger on Medical Center Parkway. I grow tomatoes in the summer, and I live in a 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow I spent 2 years building mostly with my own hands back in 1992. On the outside, I look like exactly what my son-in-law thought I was. A quiet old man with nowhere important to be and nothing in particular to protect. Sawyer Reed had been married to my daughter Alma for just under 2 years. From their first Thanksgiving together, he'd been sizing up my house the way a developer sizes up a vacant lot, calculating square footage, estimating potential, mentally knocking down walls. He had a habit of walking slowly through rooms with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ceiling, the baseboards, the windows. Not like a guest, like an appraiser. "You built this yourself?" he asked me the first time he came over for dinner. "Mostly," I said. He nodded like that was mildly interesting. Solid, little dated but solid. I let that go. I'm good at letting things go. Alma had been one of my students. Not a foster child, not a ward of the court. Just a 17-year-old girl sitting in third-period wood construction when her parents were killed in a pileup on I-24 during her senior year. She had no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents still living. My wife Pearl and I became her emergency guardians for the last 8 months of high school, and then she just never fully left. Not because she had nowhere to go. She did fine on her own eventually, got her associate's degree in business administration, got her own apartment in Nashville. She left because she wanted to. She came back to our table for holidays because she chose to. She called me Dad because it fit, and Pearl and I called her our daughter because that's what she was. She'd been our daughter for 14 years when she married Sawyer. Sawyer's parents, Clarence and Maxine Reed, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Smyrna, about 20 minutes away. They were decent enough people on the surface. Clarence had worked 30 years for an insurance company. Maxine had been a dental hygienist. They were getting older. The apartment lease was coming up, and they wanted to be closer to their son. What Sawyer had apparently decided, without asking anyone, was that closer to Sawyer meant inside Ernest Baylor's house. He laid it out that March morning like he was presenting a business proposal. Sat at my kitchen table, opened the folder, slid a brochure across to me. Sunrise Ridge Senior Community, just off Old Fort Parkway. Indoor pool, movie nights. A dining room that looked like a Holiday Inn banquet hall dressed up to seem cheerful. "You're 64, he said. "You've got this big house by yourself. My parents are at a crossroads. It's a natural solution." "I'm 64, not 84, I said. He smiled patiently. "There's no shame in planning ahead." I looked at the brochure. Then I looked at my kitchen. The countertops I'd laid myself. The cabinets I'd built from red oak I milled in my own workshop. The window over the sink that Pearl had picked out in 1993, because it looked out over the garden. I thought about the workshop out back, where I'd spent most of my Saturday mornings for the last 30 years. Where 6 young people from the community college apprenticeship program I still volunteer with were expecting me the following weekend. "Let me think about it," I said. Sawyer clicked his pen like I'd agreed. "The lease is up June 1st. That gives us about 10 weeks to plan the transition." I didn't say anything to that. What Sawyer had never bothered to notice, because he walked through my house like an appraiser, not a son, was the workshop. He'd been inside it exactly once, for maybe 3 minutes, while I showed him where I kept the outdoor extension cords. He hadn't looked at the walls. If he had, he'd have seen 32 years of names. Every student who completed my program got their name on a piece of mahogany trim, cut and engraved on the router table, mounted in alphabetical rows that now covered 2 full walls of that workshop. 219 names, the last time I counted. Underneath each name, in smaller lettering, what they were doing when I last heard from them. Toby Greer, City Councilman, District 4, Murfreesboro. Buck Selden, owner, Selden & Sons Construction. 42 employees. Inez Okafor, owner, Okafor Electrical Services. Cooper Haynes, owner, Haynes Plumbing and Mechanical, Dex Murillo. Site Superintendent, Turner Construction, Nashville. And on for 2 full walls. Sawyer thought I was a quiet old man in a house that was too big for him. He didn't know that house was the reason 219 people had learned what they were capable of. He didn't know that every summer I hosted a cookout in the backyard, and that last July, 53 of my former students had shown up with their families, filling my yard with lawn chairs and smoke from the grill and children running between adult legs and 6 conversations happening at once that I couldn't follow because they were all overlapping. He didn't know that when Pearl died 3 years ago, 42 of those names on the wall had driven to Murfreesboro in the middle of a work week to sit in pews at her funeral. He saw an old man with an old truck. He had no idea what was standing behind me. Things got worse quickly after that March morning. Sawyer started bringing it up at every family dinner. Natural solution, planning ahead, responsible transition. When Alma pushed back, he'd redirect past her to me like she wasn't in the room. When I said nothing, he read silence as agreement. By April, he was calling Sunrise Ridge to ask about unit availability. Then he made his real move. Our neighborhood has one of those homeowners associations that meets the second Tuesday of every month in the Fellowship Hall at Calvary Baptist on Broad Street. I'd been a member for 16 years. Knew most of the neighbors well enough to wave, knew some well enough to share a fence line and an honest conversation. Sawyer showed up to the April meeting uninvited. I was already sitting in the second row when I saw him walk in the door with his folder. He waited until old business was finished. Then he raised his hand and stood up without being recognized, which told you something about him right there. I want to bring up something that affects the neighborhood, he said. Some of you know my father-in-law, Ernest Baylor, at 214 Clover Hill. Great guy, long-time resident. But he's at a stage in life where he needs more support than a 3-bedroom house can provide. I felt the room shift. Heads turned to look at me. He kept going. His parents. The apartment lease. The natural solution. He laid it out the same way he'd laid it out at my kitchen table. Matter of fact. Like it was already decided. Like I was a logistics problem he was working through in public. He mentioned Sunrise Ridge by name. He mentioned that the house would stay in the family. Which struck me as interesting, because Sawyer Reed and I share no blood. His parents and I share no blood. By his own logic, the phrase made no sense at all. I let him finish. The room was quiet. Then I stood up. Sawyer, I said, you keep mentioning keeping this house in the family. Help me understand something. You and I aren't related. Your parents and I aren't related. My name is on that deed, and it has been for 32 years. Whose family, exactly, are you planning to keep it in? I heard someone snort 2 rows back. Sawyer's face went still. That's not the point, he said. Seems like the point to me, said Toby Greer, who was sitting 4 seats behind me because he lived 3 houses down and came to every HOA meeting. He hadn't been my student in 18 years, but he still called me Coach Baylor. It's his house, Sawyer. His name's on the deed. Sawyer looked around the room and recalibrated. I'm just saying, as a family, we want what's best for Ernest. Then ask Ernest what he wants, said Helen Kowalski from across the aisle. She'd lived on Clover Hill for 22 years. You never asked him, did you? He hadn't, and everyone in that room could see it. I sat back down. I looked at Sawyer standing there with his folder, and I felt something settle inside me. Not anger exactly, more like a decision becoming final. Sawyer, I said quietly, I'll give you an answer by Saturday, but I need to make some calls first. I don't think he understood what that meant. That night, I opened the contacts on my phone and started at the top. Toby answered on the first ring. Coach Baylor, what do you need? I explained the situation. There was a pause. Saturday, he said. That's when he's planning to bring in the movers. Another pause, then, I'll make some calls too. By Thursday morning, my phone had become something I could barely keep up with. Buck Selden called from a job site in Smyrna. I've got 3 crew trucks available Saturday morning. Just say the word. Inez Okafor called from Nashville. I can be there by 8. I'm bringing decks. Cooper Haynes called from his shop. Me and 4 of my guys are coming. I heard from people I hadn't spoken to in 5, 7, 10 years. A woman named Fern, who'd become a building inspector, called from Knoxville. A young man named Rafe, who ran a millwork shop in Chattanooga, asked if he could bring his business partner. An apprentice I'd barely known, graduated just 3 years before I retired, called to say he'd heard from someone and wanted to come. I tried to tell each of them it wasn't necessary. Nobody listened. Friday evening, the first vehicles started showing up. Buck Selden pulled into my driveway at 4:30, still in his Selden and Sons polo, dust on his work boots. He walked through the workshop slowly, touching the router table, the table saw, the wall of names. He found his own. He stood there for a long moment and didn't say anything. "This wall," he finally said. "I always forget how many people are on this wall." By 6 o'clock, there were 11 vehicles on Clover Hill that hadn't been there that morning. Work trucks and personal pickups, mostly a few sedans. By 8 o'clock, there were 23. The kitchen was full of people eating the pot of chili Alma had started making at noon, after Toby had called her and told her what was happening. She'd been quiet all week, caught somewhere between her husband and her father, and I hadn't pushed her. But that Friday night she stood at my stove and fed whoever walked in the door. And somewhere around 7 o'clock, she stopped looking like someone split down the middle. People filled the workshop in the backyard and spilled into the living room. Inez Okafor sat with me on the back porch, and we talked for an hour about her first week in my class, when she'd been so frustrated she'd nearly quit. "You told me the joint would either fit or it wouldn't," she said, "and that there was no use getting emotional about the gap. You just had to measure again." "I remember," I said. "I think about that whenever a job goes sideways." She paused. "I use it as the philosophy for my whole company, basically. Measure again. No shortcuts." Inside, I could hear Alma laughing at something Cooper said. It was the first time all week. Sawyer texted her at 9:30. She showed me the phone. "Where are you? Why are there so many cars on your dad's street?" She set it face down on the porch railing without answering. Saturday arrived clear and cold, the kind of March morning that smells like frozen ground beginning to thaw. I was up at 5:30. Alma was already in the kitchen. By 7:30, 41 vehicles were parked on Clover Hill and the 2 streets feeding into it. Work vans with company logos down their sides. Selden and Sons Construction, Haynes Plumbing and Mechanical, Okafor Electrical Services, Murillo Site Services, personal pickups with toolboxes in the beds, a couple of cars with out-of-state plates, a county van from the Rutherford County Workforce Development Program, because one of my former students now ran it and had driven down at 6 in the morning. They weren't standing at attention. They weren't holding signs. They were just there. On the porch, on the front walk, in the yard, leaning against trucks in the street. 41 people who had learned something real in a room I still owned, gathered around the house I'd built with my hands, because they didn't want to see me pushed out of it. Toby Greer stood near the front walk in his council blazer. He'd told me the previous evening about a city designation he'd quietly applied for 3 weeks ago, after Alma had mentioned the situation to him in passing. I hadn't known he'd done it. He'd filed a request for the workshop to be registered as a community vocational training site, which meant any change of property use or ownership triggered a mandatory 60-day planning review by the city. The paperwork had cleared on Thursday. Sawyer's truck turned onto Clover Hill at 8:57. He had to park 2 blocks away because there was nowhere closer. I watched him get out and stand in the street, looking toward my house. His parents climbed out behind him. He walked slowly. The expression on his face was the one people get when they're trying to recalibrate so fast they look like a machine that can't find the network. The moving truck turned the corner at exactly 9 o'clock and stopped. The driver rolled his window down, looked at the street line solid on both sides, and idled where he was. Sawyer stopped at the edge of my property. 41 people looked at him. Buck Selden stepped forward first. "You must be Sawyer," he said, the way a man says something pleasant when he's about 20% pleasant and 80% something else entirely. "I'm Buck Selden. Ernest had me in shop class my junior year at Glenridge. I now run a 42-person construction company." He offered his hand. Sawyer shook it mechanically. Inez Okafor stepped up beside Buck. "Inez Okafor, Okafor Electrical Services. Ernest's program is the reason I own a licensed electrical contracting business instead of working for somebody else's." She did not offer her hand. "Cooper Haynes, Dex Murillo, Fern from Knoxville, Rafe from Chattanooga." One by one, name and title, former students stepped forward and said out loud what they did and how they'd gotten there. The street was completely quiet except for their voices. Sawyer stood and received it like a man standing in cold rain with no coat, nowhere to go. Toby stepped forward last. Toby Greer, Murfreesboro City Council, District 4. I've also been Ernest's neighbor for 6 years. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. I wanted you to have this. It's a copy of the community site designation for the workshop on this property, registered with the city this past Monday. Any transfer triggers a 60-day mandatory review by the planning office. My office number's on the cover page if you have questions. Sawyer took the paper. He looked at it. He looked at the street. He looked at the moving van sitting idle 2 blocks back. Then he looked at me. Ernest, he started. It's Dad, Alma said. We both turned. She'd come out of the house and was standing on the front porch, arms crossed. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't tearful. She was calm the way water goes calm after something heavy drops in. You've been calling him Ernest all morning, she said. His name is Dad. Sawyer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. This is his house, she said. He built it himself. He's lived in it for 32 years. His wife is buried 2 miles from here. His workshop has 219 names on the wall. She looked out at the street full of people and her voice stayed level. These are his people. And I'm his daughter. That's what this family looks like, Sawyer. All of it. Right here. Sawyer looked at the document in his hand. He looked at the moving truck. He looked at 41 people who had at some point learned to build or wire or fit pipe in my workshop, and who had driven here on a Saturday morning to stand in my yard. Cancel the truck, he said quietly into his phone. He turned and walked back toward his car without another word. His parents followed. Maxine glanced back at me once. I don't know what was in that look, but I thought it might have been shame. The truck backed out of the block and drove away. 41 people stayed for another 2 hours. Buck's crew noticed a drainage issue along my back fence line they'd spotted the previous evening. They showed up Saturday morning with the right equipment and fixed it before noon. Inez pulled the panel off my breaker box, which I'd been meaning to have checked for a year. Cooper reseated a toilet flapper upstairs that had been running since winter. Nobody asked if it was okay. They just measured the problem and did the work. The consequences for Sawyer came in the weeks after, quiet and thorough. Buck Selden let me know, without making a production of it, that he'd ended preliminary talks with a real estate firm over a renovation contract after learning it was Sawyer's employer. That was somewhere near $400,000 in potential work gone. He mentioned it the way you mentioned the weather. The HOA sent Sawyer a formal letter noting that his conduct at the April meeting had been inconsistent with association guidelines and asking him not to address the group on behalf of another property owner without that owner's written consent. It was polite. It was also the kind of letter that, once sent to every member, tells the whole neighborhood the story. Alma filed for separation 6 weeks later. She did it quietly, the way she did most hard things. She moved back into her old bedroom while she looked for a new apartment, and for 3 months the house had a different kind of fullness to it. Not the noisy fullness of 41 people in the yard, but the quieter kind, 2 people figuring out how to be what they'd always been to each other. She started helping with the Saturday workshop sessions. She turned out to be better at explaining patience to the young apprentices than I was, which I told her, and she laughed and said she'd had a good teacher. There's a young man in the program right now, 19 years old, who reminds me of Buck at that age. Stubborn, talented, annoyed when something doesn't work on the first try. Last Saturday, he spent 45 minutes on a single mortise and tenon joint that kept coming out a 1/16 of an inch off. He nearly quit twice. I could see it in his shoulders. Measure again, Alma told him from across the bench. He looked at her. It's not going to close until you know exactly where the gap is, she said. There's no shortcut for that part. He measured again. He found it. He cut it right the second time, and the joint fit without a gap, and he held it up and looked at it for a long moment, like he was deciding whether to believe it was real. Sawyer came to my door on a Thursday evening in September, alone, no folder. He stood on the porch and we looked at each other for a moment, and then I opened the door wider and he came in. I owe you an apology, he said, sitting down at my kitchen table. The same table. A real one. I treated you like a problem to be managed, and I treated Alma like a piece of the solution. I was wrong about what family meant. I was wrong about what you had here. I was wrong about most of it. He stopped. He didn't try to fill the silence. I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. We talked for 2 hours, and I'll tell you plainly, it wasn't comfortable and it wasn't resolved. Redemption doesn't happen in a conversation. It happens in what a person does with the conversation, in the weeks and years that follow, in whether they actually measure the gap or just decide they've done enough by admitting one exists. But I've spent 32 years watching young people learn things the hard way, in a room full of tools that don't forgive impatience or shortcuts. I know what someone looks like when they've finally stopped arguing with the measurement. I know what it looks like when a person is ready to make a second cut. Family isn't a deed, I told him before he left. It's not bloodlines and it's not paperwork. It's the 219 names on that workshop wall, every one of them someone who showed up, put in the time, and built something meant to last. He nodded and stood. I walked him to the door. I can't tell you whether there's a way back with Alma, I said. That's her call, not mine. But there's always a way back to being a person worth something. That one's entirely up to you. He left. I walked out to the workshop. The Saturday crew was already there. 6 young people with tape measures and pencils behind their ears, ready to learn how to make something with their hands that would stand up after they were gone. Alma was pulling stock for the morning's cabinet project. Someone had started a pot of coffee. The morning light came through the workshop windows the way it always has, the way it did when Pearl was still alive, and we were just figuring out this house and what we wanted it to hold. Some things, if you build them right and maintain them honestly, last a long time. Blood is biology. Family is who shows up when it matters and stays to do the work.